All right, so good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to see all of your faces here. So my thesis is titled "The Potential for Capitol State Forest as a Wildlife Corridor and How It Can Be Strengthened." All right, I was initially inspired to study this topic by this fantastic image by Conservation Northwest. It shows all of this great wildlife movement happening from the Cascade Mountain Range to the Olympic Peninsula. And so I called them and asked, do you have data on this wildlife movement that's happening here? And I got in touch with Brian Stewart. And he said, well, we're using WSDOT data of roadkill and wildlife vehicle collisions, but we would love some data in the forests. And we don't have anyone in Capitol State Forest area. And so if you would like to, that would be great. And so to introduce Capitol State Forest, I'm not sure how familiar all of you are. It's pretty close. It's, over 100,000 acres. It's managed by DNR under the State Forest Management Plan, which came out in 2008 and then was partially updated in 2013. And it's also under the 1997 Habitat Conservation Plan, both of which are actually due for an update. So this is kind of an exciting time in the management of the region to fully consider all of its potential. We know that there are elk, black bear, deer, coyote, cougar, bobcats. There's salmon, there's cutthroat, there's insects and invertebrates, birds, reptiles, amphibians. It's really got a robust amount of life, but it is heavily impacted by forestry and recreation. And within Washington State, we have what are called legacy forests. And these were lands granted by the federal government to Washington when they became a state, and the revenue of which was supposed to benefit the public good. And they are considered naturally regenerated. They were logged when equipment wasn't as heavy and impactful on soil and before heavy clear cutting and stumping started being done. So a lot of times these forests are more complex. And they look really different from planted timber plantations. So I thought they would be a good place to put my cameras. Here's some other ways to look at Capitol State Forest. There's a digital elevation model I made in ArcGIS that really shows how much slope and terrain change. Capitol Peak actually sits at 2,658 feet, and I think it's actually this one right here out of the two. And then also watersheds, which are so important for wildlife and also logging. But so Capitol State Forest has three main watersheds. On the bottom left is Goldsboro Creek, and that empties into Grays Harbor. On the top right is McLean, and that empties into Puget Sound frontage. And then this bottom right is the largest one, which is the Chehalis River and Black River watershed basin. And it's got a lot of water, a lot of streams within its boundaries. So research has shown that habitat connectivity projects tend to be expensive, time-consuming, resource-intensive, and incredibly complex. The I-90 here in Washington from Hyack to Eastman, I believe that series of crossings and structures that they've done cost them almost 900 million, but it is so worth it. And the one that's happening right now outside of LA, the Wallace-Annenberg one, I'm not sure if you guys have heard about it, but that one is at 92 million so far. But road ecology has really shown us the need for these kinds of structures and crossings. Roads have had such a huge impact on wildlife. And moving into climate change being a more impactful reality, we need to really plan in wildlife movement. Camera traps are inexpensive and easy to use, and they give you the ability to estimate population density and some habitat behaviors. So they've really gotten popular for both scientists and also hunters who are curious about wildlife movement throughout the landscape. And we know that I-5 has been a large barrier to wildlife, and that crossings and, crossings would be beneficial to end some of the collisions that are happening in the area. To go a little bit deeper into what we know about I-5, so the Washington Wildlife Habitat Connectivity Working Group is, they first did a statewide analysis in 2010, and then they did another one in 2020, where they're really in 2020 looking at this region that's identified in the images, the Cascades to Coast region. And so this is a multi-agency group. It's a partnership. It's like US Forest Service, DNR, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Conservation Northwest. And they're all working together to sort of comb out the details on wildlife movement in Washington State and how it can better be supported. These maps were created using Linkage Mapper. And again, a lot of the data is from WashDOT. And so on the priority crossing area, which is the one to the left, they use a 5-species guild analysis. So they look at the habitats, and I listed them here. So they have the generalist, the grassland, early stage coastal forest, late stage coastal forest, and riparian. And then they overlap them together. So the deeper blue is there's 5 species that could overlap in those environments, whereas the light green is down to just 1 species. And then the next image is the least cost corridor. And so this is something that could help guide making decisions on what's feasible in particular with anything that involves a lot of governmental planning and agencies. And so the least cost corridor are those little light blue lines. I'm sorry, the screen is so high for the people in person. You can see in both maps, though, that Capitol State Forest has been identified as a natural core area. And so when I found this, I thought that that was really exciting. And then even further, within the same report all the way on the right is their result that actually focusing on south of Olympia on I-5 is our best chance to improve habitat connectivity and strengthen that coast to Cascades region. And so here is where I get into my study design. So I found this on the bottom left is a field map that was made by prior MES students, and it identified legacy forest parcels that were due to be logged. So I thought, well, why don't I study these because they are going to be more complex, potentially have more biodiversity. And I had this great map that I could take out into the field. Well, the roads were not really well represented. And so that posed challenges reaching some of the interior in the park, especially. And there's a lot of private landowner that creates buffers around some of these areas. And you can see on the right, there's a 2022 satellite image, and there is a lot of logging happening in this area. So I was able to reach and access reliably these 10 sites throughout Capitol State Forest. I tried to put 2 cameras in each legacy forest parcel about 1 kilometer apart. And my observation window was January to March. Bears is this one up here behind McLean Creek. And Juneau is this one way down here. And just due to the shape of those, I was only able to get 1 camera in each parcel. And so my results were surprisingly more people than wildlife. But again, that's likely due to where I could place the cameras, which was likely due to where I had access. I thought with the land use application, I would be able to, I don't know, get deeper into DNR land, but due to safety, they don't open gates for people. And they, so that's just a reality, but it also confirms Conservation Northwest habitat model that they were looking at. And I sort of, at this point, decided to start reaching out to private landowners to see if they had any interest in taking some game cameras from me so that I could continue to get a more clear picture. So far I have 2 takers, and we're gonna keep going. The discussion after my results is, I think that heavy presence of recreation opportunities in these areas do really bring a lot of people there. obviously people enjoy taking a walk in the woods. And so that is something that could be further studied. Here in Thurston County, we have so many options for green space to visit, to recreate in. So I think it's kind of curious that people are going out of their way to these places that don't have public transit options. And, we could look at visitors. We can look at a lot of people with their dogs. A lot of people came in parties of more than one. And so there could be, I think, some interesting study about the impact that forests have on human visitors as well. But back to mine, I could also, in studying wildlife, trim, if I got deeper into the parking areas, I could maybe more aggressively trim. I did not trim very heavily the surrounding flora on my camera installations because I was concerned about theft. And I think what I would do differently is I would more aggressively trim and just deal with theft if that happened, rather than plan for it, because I did not really have any of my cameras bothered by people. I had a few neighbors call me because I put phone numbers on them. But so in conclusion, Capitol State Forest does have viable habitat options that we already know of from these prior studies. And we know what species are likely to make use of them. We know that we need to improve connectivity into and out of Capitol State Forest for it to be a viable corridor. And so that would include Interstate 5, but also State Highways 8 and 12. And the further, as I said, the significant number of detections of people in those places such as Juneau, Sparrowhawk, and Class Dismissed, which had tons of mountain biking evidence, there's a state trust land transfer process that could be invoked that would transition those to recreation purposes, which I think if the number of people that visited these sites in the middle of winter is any indication, that would probably be beloved by our community. And right now, there's a lot of funding for connectivity projects that have come federally, and there's some momentum in the state. So it seems like there is a great policy window to work on these types of projects. As John said, I'll be continuing to monitor wildlife for Conservation Northwest, and I am working with some friends of mine who I've now made who have property up against some of these woods. And I'm going to try to develop a wildlife corridor proposal that is, instead of based on predicted habitats, is based on data that we've gathered from animal sightings and what we know about their movement. And then I've also gotten involved in hoping that legacy forests can be preserved and advocating for DNR to do an assessment and an audit. Because there's a certain amount of wood, mature forest, that they're supposed to leave so that it can age into old growth. And that is in their plan. And we're not sure that they're meeting those metrics right now. And then also becoming involved in the Commissioner of Public Lands race, which is going to determine what happens with our public lands and what kind of projects we prioritize. And I just want to say thank you to everybody, and thank you to my cohort. Thank you to Evergreen State College, of course, and the Thesis Fund, the Science Support Center. I appreciate DNR and their permission for camera installations and all the staff that helped me get that going. And thank you to Brian Stewart, Tanner Humphreys, Conservation Northwest, and John Withy for being my reader. And also my husband who helped me install cameras, and Bonnie Blessing. I really appreciate all the people that made this real. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, do you think you got a fair number